The scream came from a room that was not supposed to exist. Julian Ashbourne stopped walking so fast that his boots skidded on the old stone floor. He had only been inside Renwick Hall for 10 minutes, and already the house felt wrong. The sound had come from somewhere above him, muffled by thick walls, cut off almost as soon as it began, as if someone had pressed a hand over a mouth. He looked at the steward beside him, a thin man named Peter Ludlow who managed the estate's accounts. Peter had gone pale. "What was that?" Julian asked. "Nothing, Your Grace. Whined through the old chimneys. This house is full of strange sounds." Julian did not believe him for a moment. He had spent 6 years commanding men at sea, and later managing his own vast estate in the north. He knew the difference between wind and a human voice. That had been a woman, and she had been afraid. He had come to Renwick Hall because of a debt. The late Lord Vane had owed Julian's family a considerable sum, money borrowed years ago to save the estate from ruin, and now that the old lord was dead, the debt fell to whoever controlled Renwick Hall. That control, as far as Julian understood, belonged to Lady Margaret Vane, the widow, and her nephew Edmund, who had stepped in to manage the estate's affairs. Julian's solicitor had written ahead, and Julian had expected a simple visit, some uncomfortable conversation about repayment, and then a return home within the week. He had not expected to hear someone crying out from behind a wall. "Show me the east wing," Julian said. Peter's hands twisted together. "The east wing has been closed for years, Your Grace. It is not safe. The floors have rotted through in places." "Then I will walk carefully." "Lady Margaret would not wish." "Lady Margaret is not the one I asked. You are." Peter hesitated, clearly caught between two masters, and in the end his loyalty to the family that paid him won out. He led Julian back down the main staircase instead, chattering nervously about the weather and the roads, and Julian let him talk, because arguing further would gain nothing. He would find his own way later. Dinner that evening was a strange affair. Lady Margaret sat at the head of the table, a handsome woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a voice that stayed pleasant no matter what she said. Her nephew Edmund sat across from Julian, young, well-dressed, and watching Julian with the careful attention of a man counting his own advantages. "We are so pleased you have come yourself, Your Grace," Lady Margaret said, "rather than sending a solicitor to hound us like debt collectors." "I prefer to see things with my own eyes," Julian said, "especially when a debt this large is involved. Of course, Renwick Hall has fallen on difficult times since my husband's passing. I hope you will be patient with us. I intend to be fair, but I also intend to understand exactly what I am being fair about." Julian set down his glass. "Tell me, does anyone else live in this house besides the 3 of us and the staff?" The question landed like a dropped plate. Edmund's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Lady Margaret's smile did not move, but something behind her eyes went very still. "No one else, Your Grace," she said. "Why do you ask?" "I thought I heard a voice earlier, a woman's voice." "You must be tired from your journey. This house plays tricks on visitors. The wind, the old pipes. Everyone says the same thing at first." It was the same excuse Peter had given, word for word, and that told Julian more than either of them realized. A lie repeated by 2 different people was not a coincidence. It was a story they had agreed on in advance. Julian said nothing more about it that night, but he did not sleep. He lay awake in the guest bedroom listening to the house settle around him, the creak of old wood, the distant call of an owl, and underneath it, twice, so faint he could have imagined it, that same broken sound from before, a voice, crying, or perhaps singing, cut off too quickly to be sure. Near midnight he rose, lit a small lamp, and went looking. The east wing was easy enough to find once he knew where to look. A corridor on the 2nd floor simply stopped at a heavy oak door, the kind that had once separated servants' quarters from the family's rooms, or perhaps sealed off a section of the house no one wanted to maintain anymore. The door was locked. Julian pressed his ear to the wood and heard nothing at first, only the ordinary silence of an old house at night. Then, faintly, footsteps. Slow, careful, moving away from the door rather than toward it. "Hello?" Julian said quietly. The footsteps stopped. "I mean you no harm," he said. "I only want to know who is there." Silence answered him, but it was a listening silence, not an empty one. He could feel, somehow, that someone stood on the other side of that door, holding their breath, deciding whether to answer. "My name is Julian Ashbourne," he said. "I am a guest in this house. If you are in trouble, I can help you." Still nothing. He waited a long while, long enough that his lamp began to burn low, and eventually, he accepted that no answer would come that night. He returned to his room, but sleep would not find him. He kept thinking of the scream from the afternoon, the practiced lie at dinner, the careful footsteps retreating from a locked door instead of approaching it. Whoever was hidden in that wing was not simply avoiding a stranger. She had been taught to hide. Someone had trained her to be afraid of being found. In the morning, Julian asked to see the household ledgers, using the debt as his excuse, and Edmund reluctantly agreed to show him the estate accounts in the study. Julian was not truly interested in the numbers, not yet. He was interested in the household itself, and while Edmund searched for a particular file, Julian let his eyes wander over the room. A portrait hung above the fireplace, an older painting of a family group, Lord Vane, younger and healthier, Lady Margaret beside him, and 2 children. One was clearly Edmund as a boy. The other was a girl, perhaps 10 years old in the painting, with dark hair and solemn eyes, standing slightly apart from the others as if she had been placed there and told not to move. "Who is this?" Julian asked, nodding at the portrait. Edmund glanced up, and for a moment something flickered across his face before he controlled it. "My cousin, Lord Vane's daughter. I did not know he had a daughter. She passed away some years ago, a fever. It was very sudden." Edmund returned to the ledgers, his voice flat and rehearsed, exactly like his aunt's had been the night before. "We do not speak of it often. It still grieves my aunt greatly." Julian looked at the portrait a moment longer. The girl's eyes seemed to hold his own, even though it was only paint on canvas. "What was her name?" he asked. "Cordelia," Edmund said, and then quickly changed the subject to a column of figures, as if speaking the name too long might summon something he did not want summoned. Julian said nothing more, but he did not believe for one moment that Cordelia Vane was dead. A house did not lock away the memory of a dead girl behind an oak door with a working lock. A house did not train the wind to sound exactly like footsteps retreating from a stranger's voice. Somewhere above him, behind that door, a woman who was supposed to be a ghost was very much alive, and Julian intended to find out why an entire family had agreed to bury her while she still breathed. That afternoon, he found an excuse to walk the grounds alone, tracing the outer wall of the house until he could count the windows of the east wing from outside. Most were shuttered tight, boards nailed across them with a carelessness that suggested no one expected anyone to look closely. But one window, high on the second floor, had its shutter cracked open just enough to let in a sliver of light. As Julian watched, a pale hand pressed briefly against the gap in the wood, fingers spread against the narrow beam of daylight, and then withdrew. He stood very still, staring up at that window long after the hand had disappeared, and made a quiet promise to himself. Whoever she was, whatever her family had done to hide her, he would not leave Renwick Hall until he had seen her face and heard her speak the truth of her own story, in her own words. Behind him, unnoticed, Lady Margaret watched from a window on the ground floor, her pleasant expression finally gone, replaced by something colder and far more calculating. Julian did not go back inside right away. He walked the length of the garden wall instead, turning the puzzle over in his mind the way he once turned over a difficult decision at sea, weighing every fact before he acted. A daughter, declared dead, painted into a family portrait and then never spoken of. A locked door in a wing the household insisted was empty. A voice that cried out and was silenced. A hand pressed to a gap in a shuttered window, as if reaching for air that was rarely allowed to reach her at all. None of it belonged to a house that had nothing to hide. He thought of his own father, and how the old Duke had always told him that debts came in more than one kind. Money was the easiest sort to measure, and the easiest sort to forgive. It was the debts of silence that did the deepest harm, the ones families paid quietly for years so that no one outside their walls would ever ask a single uncomfortable question. Julian had come to Renwick Hall to settle a debt of coin. He was beginning to suspect he would leave it having uncovered a debt of an entirely different kind. Near the kitchen door, he came upon a young housemaid carrying a tray with 2 bowls of soup, more food than would ever be needed for one absent-minded meal between 3 people at a grand table. She startled when she saw him and nearly dropped the tray. "Forgive me, Your Grace," she said quickly, dropping her eyes. "Not at all. I did not mean to frighten you." Julian kept his voice easy and unhurried, the same tone he had once used to calm frightened sailors in a storm. "You are taking that up to the East Wing, aren't you?" Her face went white. "I could not say, Your Grace. I am not asking you to betray anyone. I only want to know if someone up there is being cared for, or simply kept." The maid glanced over her shoulder, toward the hallway that led back to the main house, as though she expected Lady Margaret to appear from the shadows at any moment. "Please, sir, if they knew I spoke with you. They will not hear it from me." Julian stepped aside to let her pass, and as she hurried by him toward the servants' stair, he added quietly, Tell her that someone in this house knows she is alive. Tell her she is not as forgotten as they wish her to believe." The maid did not answer, but she did not deny it either, and that silence was answer enough. Julian watched her disappear up the narrow stairway that servants used, the one that connected to the east wing without passing through the locked oak door at all, and he understood then that the household had built two separate paths through this house, one for the family and their guests, bright and orderly and full of comfortable lies, and another hidden path used only to keep a living woman fed and unseen. He resolved to learn that second path for himself before he left Renwick Hall, whatever it cost him in Lady Margaret's good opinion, which he suspected he had already lost the moment he asked his question at dinner. He returned to his room as the sun went down, and from his window he could just make out the shuttered glass of the east wing catching the last orange light of evening. The gap in the boards had been sealed again, the sliver of daylight gone, but Julian did not look away for a long time. Somewhere behind that darkened glass, a woman who was supposed to have died years ago was very much alive, hidden away by the very people who should have protected her, and Julian Ashbourne had every intention of finding out why. The lock broke easier than Julian expected. He had not planned to force the door. He had planned to wait, to ask questions gently, to let the household reveal itself in its own time. But 2 nights after the maid carried that second bowl of soup up the servant's stair, Julian woke to the sound of weeping so raw and so close that he could not lie still and pretend he had heard nothing. He rose, took the same small lamp as before, and this time he brought a metal poker from the fireplace in his room. The oak door at the end of the east wing corridor gave way on the third strike, the old lock splitting from wood, gone soft with age. Julian stepped through into air that smelled of dust and cold stone, into a hallway that had not seen honest daylight in years. Every window here was boarded from the inside as well as the outside. Cobwebs hung heavy in the corners. And yet, halfway down the corridor, a thin line of candlelight showed beneath a second door, this one unlocked, and behind it, the crying stopped the instant his footsteps reached the threshold. "I only want to help you," Julian said through the door. "I am not one of them." A long pause. Then a voice, hoarse from disuse but unmistakably careful, unmistakably clever despite years of confinement. "That is what they told me the last time someone new came to this house, that he was different, that he could be trusted. I cannot prove it to you with words alone. But I can open this door, and you can look at my face, and decide for yourself." Julian set his hand against the wood. "I will not touch you. I will not force you to leave this room. I only want to see that you are safe." Another silence, longer this time, and then the sound of a chair being dragged away from beneath the door handle. The door opened a few inches, and in the gap stood the woman from the portrait, grown into her 20s now, thinner than she should have been, her dark hair loose around her shoulders, her eyes the same solemn eyes that had watched Julian from the canvas in the study. She held a candle in one hand and studied him with the wary attention of someone who had learned, the hard way, never to trust a kind face without proof behind it. "You are the Duke," she said. "The one they argued about at dinner. I heard them through the wall. Julian Ashbourne, and you are Cordelia Vane." Something crossed her face at the sound of her own name spoken aloud by someone outside these walls, something between relief and pain, as though she had almost forgotten the sound of it. "They told everyone I was dead," she said. "A fever, they said. There was even a small stone placed for me, out past the garden wall. I have never seen it, of course. I am not permitted past this corridor. Why? What could a woman possibly have done to deserve years locked away while her family tells the world she is buried?" Cordelia's mouth tightened, and for a moment Julian thought she would refuse to answer, would retreat back into the caution that had clearly kept her alive this long. Instead, she stepped back from the door, an invitation rather than a retreat, and led him into the small room that had been her entire world for longer than she cared to say. It was not a cell in the cruel sense, not chains or bars, but it was a cage all the same. A narrow bed, a washstand, a single shelf of books that looked read so many times their spines had cracked and been mended with thread. A small writing desk sat beneath the one window, its shutter cracked open just enough to let in the thin gray light Julian had seen from the garden 2 days before. "My father died 5 years ago," Cordelia said, sitting on the edge of the bed, while Julian remained standing near the door, giving her whatever small distance might make this conversation bearable for her. "Before he died, there was a will. I do not know every detail of it, only what I overheard through walls like this one, because that has become the whole of my education these past years, listening through walls. But I know that the will left Renwick Hall, and everything attached to it, to me, not to my aunt, not to my cousin Edmund, to me, upon my father's death or upon my marriage. whichever came first. And instead, the estate passed to Lady Margaret, because I was declared unfit. Mad, they said, prone to fits and delusions, unsafe to manage property or make decisions of my own. A physician was paid to sign papers saying so. I never saw him examine me properly. He spent perhaps 10 minutes in this room, asked me strange questions I did not understand, and left satisfied with whatever answers my aunt had already decided he would find. Cordelia's hands twisted together in her lap, the same nervous gesture Julian had seen in the steward Peter days before, as though fear moved through this entire house the same way. After that it was simple. A mad daughter could not inherit. A mad daughter needed to be protected from herself, kept somewhere quiet, somewhere she could not embarrass the family or contest what had been done to her. And if you contested it now? If you stood in front of a magistrate and told this story yourself? Who would believe a woman the whole county thinks has been dead for 5 years? My aunt has had 5 years to build her story, brick by brick, the same way this door was built. I have had 5 years to grow strange and thin and frightened in a locked room with no company but old books, which, I imagine, would only prove her case rather than mine. Cordelia looked up at him then, and for the first time her composure cracked entirely, grief and exhaustion showing plainly on her face. You should not have come here. If they learn you found me, they will only move me somewhere worse. Somewhere you cannot stumble upon by accident. Please, your grace. Leave before morning and say nothing of this. I have survived this long by being careful. I do not know how to survive being hoped for. I am not going to pretend I never heard you crying through a locked door, Julian said. And I am certainly not going to walk out of this house and leave you buried alive while your aunt spends a fortune that was never hers to spend. You do not understand what she is capable of. Then explain it to me. Everything. From the beginning, from the day your father died until tonight. I did not come to Renwick Hall looking for you, Miss Vane, but I do not intend to leave until I understand exactly what has been done to you, and exactly what it will take to undo it. Cordelia studied him a long moment, the candlelight flickering across features drawn tight with years of careful silence, and Julian watched something shift behind her eyes, some old defense finally, cautiously, beginning to lower. There is a second document, she said quietly. Besides the will, my father kept a private ledger, separate from the estate accounts, recording money he had set aside for me specifically, meant to pass to me directly and quietly, so that even if something happened to the main inheritance, I would never be entirely without means. I do not know where it is now. I believe my aunt found it and destroyed it, or hidden it somewhere in this house rather than burn it, in case she ever needed to prove she had acted honestly with the rest of the estate. She is careful that way. She keeps everything, even the evidence of her own wrongdoing, because destroying it feels to her like admitting fault, and she has never once admitted fault in her life. Then we find it, Julian said, a hidden ledger, a false physician's report, a will that names you as heir. That is not nothing, Miss Vane. That is a foundation. You say we very easily, for a man who arrived at this house 3 days ago, owed a debt of money, not trouble. I find I have changed my priorities rather quickly since arriving. Julian allowed himself a small, careful smile, the first either of them had managed since the door opened. Besides, your aunt does still owe my family a considerable sum. I intend to collect it. I simply now suspect the currency will not be coin. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Cordelia laughed, a short, startled sound, quickly muffled behind her hand as though laughter itself might carry too far through these thin, listening walls. It faded fast, replaced again by fear, but Julian had heard it, and he understood it for what it was, proof that something in her, buried nearly as deep as she herself had been buried, was still very much alive. They spoke for another hour in careful, lowered voices, Cordelia describing the household's habits, who kept which keys, when the servants changed shifts, which corridors Lady Margaret rarely walked because she found the old wing distasteful even to look at. Julian listened and remembered every detail, building a map of the house inside his mind the way he had once built maps of unfamiliar coastlines, learning the shape of danger before he attempted to sail through it. When the candle burned low and dawn threatened at the edges of the boarded window, Julian rose to leave, promising to return the following night, and to be far more careful about it than he had been breaking down her door. "Why are you doing this?" Cordelia asked as he reached the threshold. "You owe me nothing. You do not know me. A wiser man would collect his debt and ride away from whatever trouble lives inside this house." Julian paused, considering the question honestly before he answered it. "Because I heard you cry out on my first afternoon here, and everyone in this house lied to my face about it, twice, in the same words, as if they had rehearsed the lie together. I have spent my life around men who lie for profit and men who lie out of fear, and I have learned to recognize both kinds quickly. Your family's lie was the fear kind. That told me there was something worth being afraid of. I intend to find out exactly what, Miss Vane, and I intend to see you standing in daylight before I am finished." He left her then, easing the broken door shut behind him as quietly as he could, and made his way back through the cold, dust-thick corridor toward his own room, already turning over in his mind where a careful, frightened woman might have hidden a private ledger inside a house built entirely on secrets. Behind him, in the small room with its cracked shutter, Cordelia Vane sat very still for a long while after he had gone, staring at the space where he had stood, feeling something she had not allowed herself to feel in 5 long years. It was not quite hope. It was too early, too dangerous, to call it hope outright, but it was close enough to hope that it frightened her almost as much as her aunt did, and she did not sleep again before morning. She spent the gray hours before sunrise doing what she had always done when fear grew too large to sit with quietly. She read. She took down one of the worn books from her shelf and turned its pages without truly seeing the words, her mind circling instead around the stranger who had broken her door and asked to know her name. In 5 years, no one had asked her name as though it mattered. Her aunt called her the girl upstairs when she spoke of her at all, and the physician who visited twice a year to renew his false report never called her anything but the patient, as though naming her fully might have required him to see her fully as well, and seeing her fully would have made his lie far harder to write down. Julian Ashbourne had said her name the way a person says a name they intend to remember. She told herself not to trust the feeling that gave her. She had trusted feelings before, in the earliest days of her confinement, when a young footman had once smuggled her a note promising he would help her escape through the kitchen gardens. She had waited 3 nights by the window for a rope that never came, only to learn later, through the thin walls, that her aunt had dismissed the footman the very day he made the promise, paying him handsomely to disappear rather than risk him keeping his word. Hope, in this house, had a way of being weaponized against her. It was often crueler than despair, because despair, at least, did not lie to her first. And yet, Julian had not simply promised. He had returned 2 nights running, had listened to the whole shape of her story without once looking at her the way the physician did, as though she were a puzzle to be solved rather than a person to be heard. He had asked what it would take to undo what had been done to her, not whether it could be undone at all. That distinction mattered more to Cordelia than she wanted to admit, even to herself, in the privacy of her own thoughts. By the time the first gray light crept through the crack in her shutter, she had made a decision. She would help him search for her father's ledger, carefully, without drawing her aunt's notice, because if there was even the smallest chance that the 2 of them together could find what her aunt had hidden, then the risk was worth taking. She had already lost 5 years to caution. She was not certain she could survive losing the chance in front of her now to the same caution that had cost her the rope by the window all those years ago. Down the corridor, unheard by either of them, a floorboard creaked beneath a weight that did not belong to any of the household's usual footsteps at that hour, and then went still again, as though whoever had been listening had decided, for now, to remain unseen. Someone had been in Julian's room while he slept. He noticed it the moment he woke. The small drawer of his writing desk, which he always left closed exactly 1 inch open to catch the morning light on his letters, was shut flush against the wood. A tiny thing, the kind of detail only a careful man would notice, but Julian had commanded ships long enough to trust small things, because at sea, small things were often the only warning a man received before disaster. He dressed quickly and went looking for the housekeeper, a stern older woman named Mrs. Aldridge who ran the staff with a discipline that suggested she answered to someone far more frightening than any butler. He found her in the linen room, counting sheets with the focused attention of a woman who did not want to be interrupted. "Good morning," Julian said. "I wonder if I might ask you something." Mrs. Aldridge did not look up from her counting. "Ask, Your Grace. Does anyone enter my room while I am at breakfast?" Her hands paused, just barely, over the folded linen. "The maids clean each room daily, sir, same as any house." "And does Lady Margaret often ask the maids to report on what they find in a guest's belongings?" This time Mrs. Aldridge did look up, and her expression, though carefully blank, told Julian everything her words did not. "I could not say, sir. I only give the orders I am given. I do not question them." A wise policy, in a house like this one, I imagine. Something flickered across the older woman's face, quick and gone before Julian could name it fully. Fear, certainly. But underneath the fear, something else. Tiredness, perhaps. The particular exhaustion of a person who had spent years serving a lie and was growing weary of the weight of it. "This house was not always like this, Your Grace." Mrs. Aldridge said quietly, almost too quiet to hear. "I have worked at Renwick Hall since before Miss Cordelia was born. I dressed her for her mother's funeral when she was 6 years old, and I have watched her grow into a kind, clever young woman who deserved a great deal better than what her own family has given her." She glanced toward the door, then lowered her voice further still. "I say nothing more than that, sir. I have a position to keep, and Lady Margaret does not forgive disloyalty easily. But I will say this much. Not everyone in this house agrees with what has been done, even if not everyone has the courage to say so aloud. How many in this house know the truth of it, would you guess?" "More than my lady would like to believe, Your Grace. A house this size cannot keep a secret from its own staff. Not truly. Not for 5 years running. We know. We simply do not speak of it to one another, because saying it aloud makes it real in a way that quiet suspicion does not. It is easier for some of us to pretend we only wonder, rather than admit we know for certain and have done little enough about it." Her hands returned to the linen, though her eyes stayed fixed on some point beyond it, somewhere in memory rather than in the room. "I am not proud of my own silence, sir. I want you to understand that plainly. But a woman my age, without family of her own to fall back upon, does not throw away a position lightly, not even for a cause she believes in with her whole heart." "Would you help me, if I asked?" "I did not say that, Your Grace." But she held his gaze a moment longer than necessary before returning to her linens, and Julian understood the answer well enough without her needing to speak it plainly. That evening, Julian returned to the east wing as promised, moving more carefully this time, avoiding the main corridor and taking the narrow servant's stair Cordelia had described to him, the same one the young maid had used to carry soup 2 nights before. He found Cordelia waiting, the broken door propped shut behind a chair, a single candle burning low on the small writing desk. "Someone searched my room this morning," Julian said without preamble. "I do not think it was an ordinary cleaning." Cordelia's face tightened. "My aunt suspects something. She always knows before anyone tells her directly. It is as though she can smell a change in the air of this house." She rose and crossed to the window, checking the crack in the shutter out of habit rather than necessity, the same nervous motion Julian had noticed the night before. "We must be faster than I first thought. If she believes you know about me, she will act before you can act against her. Then tell me where to begin looking for the ledger. I have thought of little else since you left. There is a study on the ground floor that was my father's, before he died. My aunt uses it now for the estate accounts, which I find almost cruel, using the very room where he once tried to protect me, to instead manage the fortune she took from me. If the ledger still exists, and I believe it does, because my aunt keeps every document she has ever used against anyone, it would most likely be there, hidden somewhere she believes is safe from casual searching. I have seen that study. Edmund showed me the estate ledgers there only 2 days ago. Then you have already stood in the room where the truth is hidden and simply did not know to look for it." Cordelia's mouth curved into something that was almost a smile, though worry still shadowed her eyes. "My father built that house himself, in a manner of speaking. He designed half its rooms before I was born. He was fond of small hidden spaces, drawers within drawers, panels that did not look like panels. As a child, I found 3 such hiding places myself, simply by playing in that room while he worked. There may be others I never discovered. If my aunt hid the ledger somewhere she considered clever, she may not realize my father built that room to be far more clever than she is. Then we search it, tonight, if possible. Tonight is too dangerous. My aunt does not sleep well and often walks the ground floor after midnight, checking doors and windows the way some people count sheep. But tomorrow evening, she and Edmund are engaged to dine with the Whitmores at the neighboring estate. The staff will be occupied with dinner preparations for their own meal, and the ground floor will be as empty as this house ever becomes." Cordelia hesitated, then added, quieter, "I would come with you, if I could. I know that room better than anyone living, but I cannot walk the main house without being seen, and being seen would undo everything we are trying to build. Then describe it to me. Every hiding place you remember, exactly as you found them as a child." They spent the next hour bent together over a scrap of paper Cordelia produced from beneath a loose floorboard beneath her bed, itself a small hidden space Julian had not noticed until she showed him, a detail that only deepened his understanding of exactly how resourceful 5 years of careful confinement had made her. She sketched a rough map of her father's old study from memory, marking each hidden space with a small careful cross, a false back to the bottom desk drawer, a panel behind the bookshelf that opened with pressure on a particular carved rosette, a space beneath a loose stone in the hearth that her father had used, she said, to hide small treasures for her to find as a game when she was very young. "He loved games," Cordelia said softly. watching the candlelight flicker over the paper. Riddles, hidden treasures, little puzzles built into the house itself. I used to think he did it simply to delight me. I understand now he may also have been preparing me for a world that would one day require me to be clever in ways a young girl should never have to be. He sounds as though he loved you very much. He did. And I believe that love is exactly why my aunt found it so easy to erase him so completely once he was gone. A man who loved his daughter enough to leave her everything was inconvenient to a woman who wanted that everything for herself. Cordelia folded the paper carefully and pressed it into Julian's hand. Be careful tomorrow night. If my aunt or Edmund return early, or if a servant loyal to my aunt notices you where you should not be, all of this becomes far more dangerous than a locked door and a broken lock. I have survived worse odds than a study full of hidden drawers. You have not survived my aunt, Cordelia said, and there was no humor in it at all. Before he left her that night, Cordelia caught his sleeve, an unusual gesture for a woman who had spent years being careful never to reach for anything too quickly. There is one more thing you should know before tomorrow, she said. My aunt does not trust locks alone. She has a habit of marking things, small threads placed across drawers, a hair laid across the seam of a door, so that she can tell if something has been touched even when nothing appears disturbed. My father taught her that trick himself, long ago, back when they were still fond of each other, before all of this. She learned it well enough to turn it against his own memory. Then I will need to be exact. Nothing moved out of place, nothing left open that was found closed. Exact and quick. She trusts her instincts more than she trusts any lock in this house, and her instincts are rarely wrong. Cordelia released his sleeve, her fingers lingering only a moment longer than necessary before she stepped back, as though she had surprised even herself with the small show of familiarity. Bring the ledger to me the moment you have it, whatever the hour. I would rather see it with my own eyes than wait until morning wondering whether you found anything at all, or whether something happened to you in that room. You are worried for me. I am worried for both of us. There is very little room left in my life for worrying about only one person at a time. She said it lightly, almost teasing, but Julian heard the truth folded inside the words, and it settled somewhere in his chest he had not expected it to reach. He left her room turning that sentence over in his mind, and did not entirely succeed in setting it aside even as he focused, the following evening, on the careful, deliberate work of searching her father's study, without leaving so much as a thread disturbed. The following evening unfolded exactly as Cordelia had predicted. Lady Margaret and Edmund departed for the Whitmore estate shortly after 5 o'clock, dressed in their finest, Lady Margaret pausing at the door to remind the staff, in a voice pitched to carry through the entire front hall, that she expected the house kept exactly as she had left it. Julian, watching from the top of the main staircase, understood the comment was not truly meant for the staff at all. It was meant for him, a warning wrapped in politeness, proof that whatever suspicion had sent someone into his room 2 mornings before had not faded in the slightest. He waited until the carriage wheels had faded fully into the evening quiet before making his way down to the study, moving with the unhurried calm of a guest who belonged wherever he walked, because a nervous man drew far more attention than a confident one. The study door was unlocked, and inside, the room looked exactly as it had 2 days before, orderly, dim, lined with shelves of ledgers and legal papers that told the story Lady Margaret wanted told. Julian began with the desk drawer, exactly as Cordelia's sketch instructed, running his fingers along the base of the lowest drawer until he found a seam that did not belong to ordinary carpentry. A gentle push, and the false bottom lifted free, revealing a narrow space beneath. Empty. He tried the bookshelf next, pressing the carved rosette Cordelia had described, and felt something give beneath his fingers, a soft click, a panel swinging inward to reveal a shallow compartment behind the third shelf, also empty, though dust marks on the wood suggested something had rested there once, and had since been moved. Before touching either drawer or panel, Julian had studied each one carefully for the kind of marks Cordelia warned him about, a stray thread, a hair laid across a seam, any sign that Lady Margaret had already claimed these hiding places for her own careful watching. He found none, which told him either that his suspicion of her thoroughness was overstated, or that she trusted the hearth far less than she trusted the desk and the shelf, having perhaps never learned of that particular hiding place at all. He worked slowly despite the pressure of time, easing the false bottom back into its original position once he confirmed it was empty, pressing the carved rosette a second time to be certain the panel behind the bookshelf closed as silently as it had opened, leaving no trace that either had been disturbed. The hearth was his last hope, and it was there, beneath a loose stone exactly where a young Cordelia had once found small treasures left by a father who loved games. that Julian's fingers found the edge of a slim leather-bound book, wrapped carefully in oiled cloth to protect it from damp. His hands were shaking slightly as he unwrapped it, not from fear but from the particular thrill of discovery. And there, in careful, precise handwriting, was Lord Vane's private ledger, dated across the final 2 years of his life, recording sums set aside specifically for his daughter, separate from the main estate, meant to be released to her directly upon her marriage, or her 25th birthday, whichever came first. Beside several entries, in the same careful hand, were small personal notes, clearly never meant for anyone but Cordelia herself to eventually read, instructions on trusted solicitors, warnings about certain relatives whose names Julian recognized immediately, and one entry, near the very last page, that made Julian's chest tighten with quiet anger on Cordelia's behalf. "If anything should happen to me before Cordelia comes of age," the entry read, "I trust that whatever guardian takes charge of her will honor what is owed to her, both in fortune and in freedom. She is not a burden to be managed. She is my daughter, and she deserves a life of her own choosing." Julian wrapped the ledger carefully back in its oiled cloth and tucked it inside his coat, close against his chest, and had just replaced the loose hearthstone when he heard the front door of the house open, far earlier than any dinner engagement should have ended. He had only seconds to decide, and he used them well, slipping from the study through the same side passage he had entered by, moving swiftly and silently down the servants' corridor toward the stairs, his heart pounding not from fear alone but from the fierce, quiet satisfaction of a man who had just found exactly what an entire family had spent 5 years trying to bury. Behind him, in the front hall, Lady Margaret Vane removed her gloves with slow, deliberate movements, her sharp eyes sweeping the empty entryway with the particular suspicion of a woman who trusted nothing and no one, especially not silence that felt, somehow, too carefully arranged. "Something is different in this house tonight," she said quietly to Edmund, who stood beside her, still in his dinner coat. "I can feel it. You are imagining things, Aunt. I have not imagined anything in this house in 30 years, Edmund. I suggest you remember that." She handed her gloves to a waiting servant and turned toward the study, her expression unreadable, her steps unhurried but purposeful, the steps of a woman who intended to find out exactly what had changed, and who would not stop until she did. A letter arrived at Renwick Hall 2 days after Julian found the ledger, sealed with a stranger's crest and addressed to Lady Margaret in a careful, businesslike hand. She read it alone in her study, and whatever it contained brought a thin, satisfied smile to her face that had nothing warm in it at all. She summoned Edmund within the hour. "It is settled," she told him, folding the letter away into a drawer that locked with a small brass key she kept on a chain at her waist. "Mr. Grey has agreed to the arrangement. He will travel from Bristol within the fortnight to make the marriage official." Edmund shifted uncomfortably in his chair. "Is this truly necessary, Aunt? She has been quiet for years. No one questions the story any longer." "Someone is questioning it now, Edmund, whether you wish to admit that to yourself or not. The Duke did not travel here merely to discuss a debt. I have watched him these past days, and I have watched the household grow strange around him. Servants glancing at doors they never used to glance at. Silences where there used to be idle chatter." Lady Margaret's voice remained perfectly composed, but her hands, folded in her lap, had gone rigid with tension. "A marriage ends the question permanently. A husband's authority over his wife cannot be challenged by an outside guest, however titled he may be. Once Cordelia belongs legally to Mr. Grey, whatever the Duke believes he has discovered becomes irrelevant. He will have no standing to interfere in another man's household. And if she refuses the marriage? She will not be given the choice to refuse, any more than she has been given the choice to do anything else these past 5 years. Lady Margaret rose, smoothing her skirts with brisk, efficient movements. "I did not build this arrangement to have it undone now, by a man with a title and a guilty conscience. Fetch my shawl. I intend to speak with her myself, tonight, and make certain she understands precisely how little room remains for foolish hope." It was this conversation, carried out an hour later in the cold, dust-heavy corridor of the East Wing, that brought Lady Margaret to Cordelia's door with a coldness sharper than any she had shown in years. "You will marry him within the month," Lady Margaret said, "or I will have you moved somewhere far less comfortable than this room." Cordelia stood very still, her father's ledger heavy in her thoughts even though it now rested safely inside Julian's coat rather than in her own hands. Her aunt had come to the East Wing herself for the first time in over a year, which told Cordelia immediately that whatever calm balance had existed between them until now had shattered completely. "Marry whom?" Cordelia asked, though she already suspected the answer would be worse than she imagined. A man named Silas Gray, a magistrate's clerk from Bristol, older than you, discreet, and very willing to overlook a wife's unusual history in exchange for a settlement large enough to secure his future comfortably. Lady Margaret's voice remained pleasant, almost conversational, the same tone she used at dinner tables and church socials, which made the words themselves land all the harder. Once you are married, your legal existence becomes his concern rather than mine. A husband can commit an inconvenient wife to an asylum with far less scrutiny than an aunt can commit a niece. It is, I am told, remarkably simple paperwork. You cannot be serious. I am always serious, Cordelia. You know this about me. Lady Margaret studied her niece with the same cold assessment she might have given a horse she was considering for sale. I had hoped to avoid this conversation. I had hoped our understanding would continue as it has these past 5 years, quietly, without unnecessary unpleasantness. But something has changed in this house since our guest arrived, and I do not intend to wait and discover exactly what. Nothing has changed. Do not lie to me. I raised liars far more skilled than you, and even they could not fool me for long. Lady Margaret moved toward the door, then paused, her hand resting on the frame. I do not know what the Duke has promised you, or what foolish hope you have allowed yourself to build around a stranger's kindness, but I have survived worse threats than one curious young man with a title and a debt to collect. Mr. Gray arrives within the fortnight. You will be married before Ashbourne even thinks to question where you have gone. She left without waiting for a response, and Cordelia sank onto the edge of her bed, her whole body trembling with a fear sharper than any she had felt in years of confinement. A locked room, however cruel, had at least been familiar. A forced marriage to a stranger who would commit her to an asylum the moment it suited him was a different kind of ending entirely, one from which there might be no door left to break down, no window left, with even a cracked shutter of daylight. She waited until nightfall, counting the minutes with an anxiety that made the hours feel endless, before Julian finally returned, moving carefully through the servant's stare as he had each time before. She told him everything the moment he stepped through the door, the words tumbling out faster than she meant to speak them, and watched his expression harden into something she had not seen on his face before, a controlled, quiet fury that reminded her, briefly, of the way her father used to look when he discovered dishonesty among the estate's tenants. A fortnight, Julian repeated when she finished. That does not give us much time. It gives us almost none. And she is not wrong to be suspicious. Something in this house has changed, and she can feel it even without proof. Then we do not wait for proof to find her first. We act before Mr. Gray ever crosses the threshold of this house. Julian drew the leather-bound ledger from inside his coat and set it on the small writing desk between them. I found this 2 nights ago, exactly where you said it would be. I did not tell you sooner, because I did not want to bring you hope until I was certain we could act on it safely. That certainty no longer exists, so I see no reason to withhold it from you any longer. Cordelia's hands shook as she opened the worn leather cover, her eyes moving quickly over her father's familiar handwriting, and Julian watched something break open in her expression, grief and vindication arriving together, inseparable from one another after 5 years of being told her memory of her own father's love had been a fever dream of a mad mind. She read the final entry twice, her lips moving silently over the words "she deserves a life of her own choosing," and when she finally looked up at Julian, her eyes were wet but her voice was steady. "This proves everything," she said. "The money set aside for me, his own words about my guardian's duty to honor it. If a magistrate saw this, alongside the physician's false report, and whatever proof exists of how quickly that report was purchased, my aunt's entire arrangement collapses. Then we bring it to a magistrate. Not one connected to your aunt's circle of friends, but someone from beyond this county, someone with no reason to favor Lady Margaret's version of events over yours. She will not simply let us walk out of this house with proof of her fraud, Julian. If she suspects for even a moment what we intend, she will move against us first. She has resources you have not yet seen. She has friends among the local magistrates already, men who have dined at her table for years and would take her word over a stranger's ledger without a second thought. Then we do not give her the chance to suspect. We need a plan that moves faster than her instincts and quieter than her spies." Julian sat beside her at the small desk, close enough now that their shoulders nearly touched, and for a moment neither of them spoke, the weight of what they were about to attempt settling over the room like a held breath. "There is a magistrate in the neighboring county, a man named Charles Whitby, who once served under my father's recommendation and owes our family a measure of genuine loyalty, not the purchased kind your aunt seems to collect. If we can reach him with this ledger and your own testimony, in person, before your aunt learns you are gone, he will have grounds to intervene formally, and quickly. Reach him how? I am not permitted past this corridor, let alone past the county line. You will need to leave this house the same way you have survived inside it, carefully, and by paths your aunt does not expect. Julian's jaw tightened with resolve. I will arrange a carriage under a false purpose. Business in the next county that requires my early departure. You will need to be inside it before dawn, hidden until we are well beyond Renwick Hall's grounds. And if we are seen leaving together? My aunt already suspects something between us. If a servant loyal to her sees me climb into your carriage in the dark, it will look exactly like the sort of scandal she could use to discredit me entirely. A mad woman running off with a duke rather than a wronged heiress seeking justice. Julian considered this a long moment, and Cordelia watched him turn the problem over with the same careful patience she had come to recognize as entirely his own. Unhurried even under pressure, the manner of a man used to commanding through storms rather than panicking through them. Then you will not leave with me, he said finally. Mrs. Aldrich has already shown more sympathy toward your situation than she has openly admitted. If she is willing, she could arrange for you to leave through the kitchen gardens before dawn, dressed as a laundrywoman making an early delivery to the village, while I depart separately, ahead of you, drawing whatever attention there is to be drawn toward my own carriage instead. We meet on the road beyond the village, where no one from this house is likely to be watching. You would trust a woman we have known for a matter of days with something this dangerous, when your own aunt has managed to fool an entire county for 5 years? I trust the tiredness I saw in her face when she spoke of you. That is not the expression of a woman still fully loyal to your aunt's version of this household. Julian reached out, not quite touching her hand where it rested on the ledger, but close enough that the intention behind the gesture was unmistakable. I know I am asking you to trust a great deal, all at once. After years of learning that trust in this house is rarely rewarded, I cannot promise you nothing will go wrong. I can only promise that I will not leave you behind to face whatever comes next alone. Cordelia looked down at her father's handwriting once more, at words written by a man who had wanted, above everything else, for his daughter to choose her own life, and felt something settle inside her that was steadier than hope and stronger than fear. Then speak to Mrs. Aldrich tonight, she said. Whatever happens tomorrow, I would rather risk everything trying to leave this room forever than spend one more year waiting quietly for my aunt to decide my fate for me. Julian nodded once, rose, and pressed her hand briefly before slipping back out through the broken door and into the dark corridor beyond, already turning over in his mind the delicate work of arranging an escape that had to succeed on the very first attempt, because Cordelia was right about one thing above all else. Lady Margaret Vane did not give second chances to those who tried her patience and failed. He found Mrs. Aldrich in the kitchen an hour later, alone, and when he laid out what he needed from her, plainly and without pretense, she did not answer immediately. She simply looked at him for a long moment, weighing years of careful silence against a debt of conscience she had clearly been carrying far longer than Julian had known her. I dressed that child for her mother's funeral, she said finally, echoing the words she had spoken to him days before, though this time her voice carried a different weight entirely, the sound of a decision being made rather than a memory being shared. I will not dress her for a wedding built on lies, while I still have breath in my body to stop it. Tell me exactly what you need, Your Grace, and I will see it done before the sun rises. Julian explained it quickly and quietly, keeping his voice low even though the kitchen stood empty at this hour. A laundrywoman's dress and bonnet, plain enough to draw no attention, left folded inside Cordelia's room before dawn. A basket of linens, real ones, to complete the disguise should anyone stop her along the garden path. And above all, silence, from Mrs. Aldrich, and from anyone else in the household she trusted enough to bring into the plan, until Cordelia was well clear of Renwick Hall's grounds and safely on the road toward the county line. There is a gate at the far end of the kitchen garden, Mrs. Aldrich said, already thinking ahead of him. It has not been used in years, not since the old gardener retired, but the lock is simple enough that I still keep a key for it in my own drawer, in case the hedges ever need clearing from that side. She could reach the village lane within a quarter hour, without ever crossing the main drive where a groundskeeper might notice her. That will do well enough. I will have a carriage waiting just beyond the village, on the road toward the county line. See that it is there before first light, Your Grace. Lady Margaret rises early on the mornings she has business to attend to, and something tells me tomorrow will be exactly such a morning, whether she has cause to suspect us or not. Neither of them noticed, in the shadowed doorway behind them, the small, silent figure of a young footman who had paused mid-step on his way to bank the fires for the night, listening long enough to hear every word, before slipping away again toward the front of the house and toward Lady Margaret's private study. where a lamp still burned late into the night. The footman reached Lady Margaret's study before the lamp had even burned low. "Speak quickly," she said, not looking up from her desk when he entered, breathless from the stairs. "Mrs. Aldridge and the Duke, my lady, in the kitchen, not an hour ago." They spoke of a laundry dress, and a gate at the back of the garden, and a carriage waiting on the county road before first light. The young man's voice shook slightly, caught between loyalty to the household that paid him and something else, some flicker of conscience he did not have the courage to act on. "I believe they mean to help Miss Cordelia leave this house tonight, my lady." Lady Margaret set down her pen very slowly, and for a long moment she said nothing at all. When she finally looked up, her expression held none of the practiced warmth she wore at dinner tables, only a cold, calculating fury that made the footman take an involuntary step backward. "Tonight," she repeated. "Before dawn, my lady. That is what I understood them to say." "Then we have very little time, and a great deal to arrange." She rose, moving with brisk purpose toward the door, already forming a plan of her own with the same ruthless efficiency she had once used to bury a living daughter behind a fever story and a locked door. "Wake Edmund. Tell him to dress and meet me in the front hall within a quarter hour. And find Grimshaw, the gatekeeper. Tell him no one leaves these grounds tonight without my direct permission, whatever excuse they offer him." The footman hesitated. "And Mrs. Aldridge, my lady?" "Should I?" "Say nothing to Mrs. Aldridge. Let her believe her little plan is still safely hidden. I would rather catch them in the act of leaving than frighten them into finding some other, less predictable way to try again." Lady Margaret's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile. "Go, quickly." 2 floors above, unaware that their plan had already been overheard, Cordelia and Julian made their final arrangements in low, urgent whispers, working against a clock that neither of them yet knew had begun running faster than they believed. "You are certain the carriage will be waiting?" Cordelia asked, folding the borrowed laundry dress Mrs. Aldridge had left for her into a tight bundle beneath her arm. "I will see to it myself before I return to my own room to prepare my departure. Everything will be exactly where it needs to be." Julian studied her face in the low candlelight, searching for any last trace of doubt, and finding instead a steady, quiet resolve that had not been there on the night he first broke down her door. "You need only reach the garden gate, and the road beyond it. I will meet you there, and from that moment forward, your aunt will have no power over either of us that a magistrate's ruling cannot undo." "I have imagined this moment for 5 years," Cordelia said softly. "I never once imagined it would feel this frightening, even now. Even with help I never thought I would have." "Fear is not the same as doubt. You are allowed to feel both fear and certainty at once. I have felt exactly that combination more times than I can count, standing on the deck of a ship in weather that should have sunk us." Julian took her hand, briefly, warmly, before releasing it again. "Before dawn. The kitchen garden gate. I will not leave that road without you, whatever happens." He left her then, slipping back through the broken door and down the narrow servant's stair, his mind already moving ahead to the carriage, the road, the magistrate waiting in the neighboring county who did not yet know how urgently his old loyalty was about to be tested. He did not know, as he crossed the dark lawn toward the stables an hour before dawn, that Grimshaw the gatekeeper had already received new instructions, or that Edmund Vane stood waiting in the shadow of the stable door, arms folded, his expression carefully blank in the manner of a man who has been told exactly what role he is meant to play tonight. "Going somewhere, Your Grace?" Edmund asked, stepping into the lantern light. Julian did not slow his pace, keeping his voice as easy and unhurried as he could manage. "Business in the next county. I mentioned it at dinner 2 nights ago, if you recall." "I recall no such mention." Edmund's eyes moved deliberately toward the small bundle Julian carried, wrapped in oiled cloth, tucked carefully beneath his arm. "That is a curious piece of luggage for a simple business trip. It is not your concern what I carry, Mr. Vane." "It is very much my concern, when what you carry appears to be my late uncle's private ledger, stolen from a hiding place my aunt did not even know I was aware of." Edmund's composure cracked slightly, revealing something underneath that was not quite his aunt's cold calculation, something closer to fear, dressed up as authority. "My aunt is already awake, Your Grace. She knows of your little arrangement with Mrs. Aldridge. The gate is watched. The stable is watched. I would suggest you reconsider whatever you believe is about to happen tonight, before it becomes a great deal more unpleasant than a simple conversation between gentlemen." Julian's stomach turned cold, understanding immediately the full weight of what Edmund had just revealed. If the gate was watched, then Cordelia, even now making her way through the kitchen garden in her borrowed laundry dress, was walking directly into a trap neither of them had anticipated. "Then I suggest you step aside," Julian said. his voice dropping into the low, commanding register he had once used to steady frightened crews in the worst storms of his career. "Because whatever your aunt has planned for tonight, I do not intend to let it happen, and you would be wise not to place yourself between me and the door." For a moment, Edmund did not move, caught between the fear of his aunt's fury and some smaller, quieter instinct Julian could see working behind his eyes, the same flicker of conscience the footman had shown before ultimately choosing loyalty over honesty. Then, unexpectedly, Edmund stepped aside. "The gate on the east side," he said quietly, refusing to meet Julian's eyes. "Not the kitchen garden gate. My aunt has men watching that one already. There is a second gate, older, further along the wall, that my uncle used when he wished to walk the grounds without being seen returning from the village. I do not know if Miss Vane is aware of it. I do not know why I am telling you this, but I have watched my aunt do a great many things in this house over the years, and I find, tonight, that I have finally run out of stomach for watching quietly." Julian did not waste time questioning the sudden change of heart. He ran. He reached the kitchen garden just as two of the household's ground staff, men Julian recognized vaguely from his days walking the estate, closed in on a small, cloaked figure near the old back gate, lanterns raised, voices sharp with the particular confidence of men following clear orders. Cordelia stood frozen between them, her borrowed bonnet fallen back from her face, her escape cut off in the very place she had trusted most to carry her to freedom. "Let her pass," Julian said, stepping into the lantern light with a voice that carried the full authority of his title, sharp and unmistakable even in the darkness. "Whatever Lady Margaret has ordered you to do, I promise you, gentlemen, that obeying her tonight will cost you far more than disobeying her ever could. I am a duke. I have witnesses to what has been done in this house, and I intend to make certain every person involved answers for it, from the mistress of this estate down to the last servant who chose to look away." The two men exchanged an uncertain glance, the confidence of clear orders wavering visibly under the weight of a title neither of them wished to cross. It was enough hesitation for Julian to close the remaining distance, place himself firmly between them and Cordelia, and for Cordelia herself, finding her courage again in the space that hesitation created, to speak for the first time in 5 years to servants who had once known her as the master's living daughter, rather than a locked-door's silence. "You knew my father," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "Both of you. I remember you from when I was a girl, before all of this. He was kind to you. He paid fair wages, and never once raised his voice on this estate. Ask yourselves honestly whether he would want you standing here tonight, stopping his own daughter from walking free." Something shifted in the older of the two men's faces, memory working against obedience, and he lowered his lantern slightly, stepping back half a pace. The younger man hesitated a moment longer, then followed his companion's lead, and the narrow path to the back gate stood open before them. "Go," Julian said quietly to Cordelia. "Now, while they are still deciding what loyalty means to them tonight." They ran together through the dark garden, past the old back gate Edmund had described, out onto a narrow lane that smelled of dew and early morning cold, and there, exactly where Julian had left it, stood the carriage, the driver already alert and watching for them, the horses restless in the gray pre-dawn light. They had barely climbed inside before the sound of hooves reached them from the direction of the house, fast and urgent, and through the small rear window Julian saw a second carriage emerging from the stable yard. Lady Margaret's unmistakable figure visible even at this distance, upright and furious, giving orders to a driver who whipped his horses into motion without hesitation. "She means to follow us," Cordelia said, gripping the edge of her seat. "Then we make certain she cannot catch us before we reach Magistrate Whitby's door." Julian rapped sharply on the roof of the carriage, calling out the destination and the urgency of it to the driver, and felt the carriage lurch forward into speed, wheels striking hard against the uneven country road as dawn began, finally, to break across the fields on either side of them. The chase that followed felt to Cordelia like the whole of her 5 locked years compressed into a single desperate hour, the carriage rattling and swaying over roads not built for such speed, Lady Margaret's carriage never quite closing the gap but never quite falling behind either, both drivers pushing their horses harder than was truly safe, the county line drawing nearer with every jolting mile. Twice Julian thought their pursuers might overtake them at a narrow bend, and twice the driver Julian had hired, a steady man who clearly understood exactly what was at stake, found some fraction more speed to keep the distance between them. They crossed into the neighboring county just as the sun cleared the horizon fully, golden light spilling across fields Cordelia had not seen with her own eyes in 5 long years, and behind them, at the very edge of that boundary, Lady Margaret's carriage finally slowed, and then stopped altogether, her authority reaching its natural limit at a line on a map that even her considerable will could not cross without proper cause. Cordelia watched through the small rear window as the distance between the carriages grew, as Lady Margaret's furious figure shrank smaller and smaller against the brightening sky, and felt something enormous and long-held finally begin, cautiously, to loosen inside her chest. "We are not finished," Julian said, watching her carefully. "She will not simply accept defeat at a county line. She has resources, connections, 5 years of a carefully built story. Reaching Whitby is only the beginning of what we must do to make certain you are truly free." "I know." Cordelia turned from the window to face him, her eyes still bright with the shock of open sky and open road after so long behind boarded windows. "But for the first time in 5 years, Julian, I am facing whatever comes next from outside that room, instead of listening to it happen through a locked door. Whatever the fight ahead costs us, I intend to fight it standing in daylight." Magistrate Charles Whitby received them within the hour, still in his morning coat, clearly startled by the sight of a duke and a disheveled young woman in a laundress's borrowed dress arriving at his door before his household had even finished laying breakfast. But his surprise gave way quickly to careful attention once Julian explained, briefly and plainly, exactly what had brought them to his doorstep at such an hour, and once Cordelia herself, steadying her voice with an effort Julian could see clearly, began to tell her own story from the very beginning. Whitby listened without interrupting, his expression growing graver with every detail, and when Cordelia finished, he sat quietly for a long moment before reaching for the ledger Julian placed on the table between them. "I knew your father a little, Miss Vane," he said finally, turning the worn pages with careful hands. "We sat on a county committee together, some years before his death. He struck me then as a man of unusual conscience, the sort who kept his word, even when it cost him something to keep it. I confess I heard the story of your death with some private surprise at the time, though I had no cause then to question it publicly." "You believe me," Cordelia said, something in her voice caught between disbelief and desperate hope. "I believe the ledger, Miss Vane, and I believe the account of a man I trusted enough to sponsor for his own position, standing here at considerable personal risk to bring you to my door rather than simply collecting the debt he came here to collect." Whitby closed the ledger carefully and set it aside. "That said, belief and legal proof are not always the same thing, and your aunt will not surrender her position without a fight, particularly not a fight that threatens to expose her to charges of fraud, false imprisonment, and worse. I will need to move carefully, and quickly, before she has time to prepare a defense of her own, or to move whatever remaining evidence still exists beyond my reach." "What do you require of us?" Julian asked. "Your testimony, both of you, given formally and on record. A physician of my own choosing to examine Miss Vane properly, to establish clearly on paper that no genuine grounds for her confinement ever existed, and, if we are fortunate, some corroboration from within the household itself, someone willing to testify against Lady Margaret directly, rather than simply whispering sympathy in dark kitchens." Whitby's gaze flicked toward Cordelia with something like quiet respect. "I understand this will not feel like victory yet, Miss Vane. Not fully. There is a difficult road still ahead of us, and your aunt will make certain every step of it is contested. But you have given me enough this morning to begin building a case that even her considerable influence will struggle to overcome." Cordelia nodded, exhaustion and resolve mingling plainly across her face, and Julian watched her sit a little straighter in her chair, as though something in Whitby's careful, methodical confidence had given her permission to believe, cautiously, that the fight ahead might actually be winnable. Outside, the morning had fully arrived, sunlight spreading warm and ordinary across Whitby's modest front garden, and Cordelia found herself staring at it through the window for a long moment, marveling at something as simple as daylight falling freely across grass and flowers, unfiltered by boards or shutters, unrestricted by anyone's permission but her own. "It is strange," she said quietly, half to herself, half to Julian, who stood near enough to hear her. "I used to dream of mornings like this one, ordinary mornings. I never imagined, in all those dreams, how loud the birds would sound, or how bright the grass would look. 5 years behind boarded windows teaches you to forget the smallest, most ordinary details of a life you once had. I had forgotten what sunlight actually felt like on my own skin. You will have a great many more mornings to remember it fully," Julian said. "I intend to make certain of that, whatever it costs, whatever fight your aunt still has left in her." Cordelia turned from the window to look at him, and for the first time since he had broken down her door 6 days before, her expression held no trace of fear at all, only a steady, quiet determination that matched his own, as she turned her thoughts toward the fight still ahead, a fight she now intended to face in daylight, in her own name, for as long as it took to win it fully. Lady Margaret Vane arrived at the county courthouse 3 weeks later dressed in her finest mourning gray, prepared to play the role of a grieving, wronged aunt, defending herself against a stranger's wild accusations. She had not expected to see Mrs. Aldridge seated among the witnesses called to testify. She had not expected the physician, a nervous man named Dr. Colton, to arrive with a written confession already prepared, having decided, under the quiet but firm persuasion of Magistrate Whitby's careful investigation, that his own freedom mattered rather more to him than his loyalty to a woman who had never once thanked him properly for his years of convenient silence. And she had certainly not expected Edmund, her own nephew, to sit in the gallery with his hands folded and his eyes fixed firmly on the floor, unwilling to meet her gaze even once during the entire proceeding. The hearing itself lasted the better part of 2 days. Julian gave his account first, calm and precise, describing exactly what he had heard on his first afternoon at Renwick Hall, what he had found behind the locked oak door, and what the ledger, entered formally into evidence, proved about Lord Vane's true wishes for his daughter's inheritance. Mrs. Aldridge followed, her voice steady despite years of practiced silence finally breaking apart in front of the entire courtroom, describing the girl she had dressed for her mother's funeral, and the woman she had watched fade slowly behind a locked door for 5 long years. Dr. Colton's confession, read aloud by Whitby himself, detailed the payment he had received to sign a false report of madness he had never genuinely believed, a payment recorded, damningly, in Lady Margaret's own household accounts under a vague heading that fooled no one once its true purpose was explained. Lady Margaret's own solicitor attempted, at several points, to challenge the proceedings, arguing that a woman confined for madness could hardly be considered a reliable witness to her own confinement, a cruel circular logic that Whitby dismissed almost as soon as it was raised, noting dryly for the record that the very physician who had authored the original diagnosis had that same morning confessed, under oath, to fabricating it entirely for payment. The solicitor tried a second approach, suggesting that whatever had happened at Renwick Hall was a private family matter, best resolved quietly, rather than aired publicly in a county courtroom. And it was this argument, more than any other, that seemed finally to exhaust Whitby's patience. A private family matter, the magistrate repeated, his voice carrying clearly across the hushed courtroom. I have sat on this bench for 11 years, and in that time I have heard a great many things described as private family matters that were, upon closer examination, simply cruelty, given a more comfortable name. A young woman was declared dead to the entire county while she remained alive and imprisoned not 2 miles from where I now sit. I do not consider that a private matter. I consider it precisely the sort of matter this court exists to address. He gestured for the solicitor to be seated, and did not permit the objection to be raised again for the remainder of the hearing. And then Cordelia spoke. She stood before the magistrate in a plain blue dress Mrs. Aldridge had helped her choose, her dark hair pinned simply away from her face, and told her story from the very beginning, from the day her father died and the world was told a fever had taken his daughter as well. She spoke of the locked door, the boarded windows, the years of listening to the household's ordinary life happen just beyond a wall she was never permitted to cross. She spoke of the footman who had once promised her a rope and a night of freedom, only to disappear before he could deliver either. She spoke, finally, of Julian Ashbourne breaking down a door he had no obligation to break, and of choosing, in that moment, to trust a stranger's kindness over 5 years of careful, learned fear. By the time she finished, there was no pretense left in the courtroom, no room remaining for Lady Margaret's carefully rehearsed grief to hold any weight at all. Magistrate Whitby delivered his ruling with the same careful, methodical calm he had shown from the very first morning Julian and Cordelia arrived at his door. The false declaration of Cordelia Vane's death was struck from every record that held it. Her father's true will, supported now by the private ledger and by testimony too thorough to dismiss, was restored in full, naming her the rightful heir to Renwick Hall and everything attached to it. Lady Margaret Vane was formally charged with fraud and unlawful confinement, charges that would, in the weeks that followed, see her stripped of every remaining claim to the estate she had stolen, and eventually removed from the county entirely. Her name become a quiet scandal whispered at the very dinner tables where she had once held court so confidently. Edmund fared somewhat better, largely because he had, in the final hour, chosen to point Julian toward the east gate rather than stand fully against him, and because his testimony, once he finally found the courage to give it honestly, corroborated much of what Cordelia and Mrs. Aldridge had already described. He would not inherit Renwick Hall, nor any part of the fortune his aunt had tried to steal on his behalf, but he left the courthouse a free man rather than a charged one, and something in his bearing, chastened and quiet, suggested he understood exactly how narrowly he had escaped becoming as guilty as his aunt, in the eyes of the law and his own conscience alike. In the weeks between the hearing and her formal return to Renwick Hall, Cordelia stayed as a guest in Julian's own townhouse in the county seat, and it was there, away from every wall that had once held her prisoner, that she began slowly relearning the ordinary rhythms of a free life. She walked in the small garden each morning simply because she could, lingering far longer than the garden itself warranted, simply enjoying the sensation of open air on her face, without a single locked door standing between herself and the sky. She visited the village shops with Mrs. Aldridge, who had left Lady Margaret's service the moment the household was formally dissolved, and accepted, gladly, a permanent position in Cordelia's own eventual household instead. She discovered that crowds still unsettled her, that loud sudden noises still made her flinch in ways she was not proud of, and that certain kindnesses from strangers, offered without any hidden motive behind them, could still catch her entirely by surprise and bring unexpected tears to her eyes. Julian never once pushed her to move faster than she was ready to move. He accompanied her on her morning walks when she wished for company, and left her to her own quiet thoughts when she did not, and slowly, over the course of those weeks, Cordelia found herself looking forward to his presence, not merely as the man who had rescued her, but as a companion in his own right, someone whose steady patience matched her own careful, hard-won courage, in ways she had not expected to find in anyone, let alone a duke who had arrived at Renwick Hall seeking nothing more than the repayment of an old debt. It was during those same weeks that Cordelia finally visited her father's grave for the first time since his death, standing beside the small stone marker with Julian a respectful distance behind her, and spoke aloud, for the first time in 5 years, everything she had wanted to say to him and never had the chance to. She thanked him for the hidden ledger, for the careful games that had taught her patience and cleverness she had needed more than he could have known, and for loving her enough, even from beyond his own death, to leave behind proof that she was never the burden her aunt had claimed her to be. Renwick Hall itself, once the legal proceedings concluded, passed fully and finally into Cordelia's hands. She returned to it for the first time in 5 years on a bright autumn afternoon, standing in the front hall where she had once been carried out as a supposedly dying child and never allowed to return through the front door again, and felt the strange, disorienting mixture of grief and homecoming that only a place holding both childhood happiness and years of confinement could produce. "It feels smaller than I remember it," she said to Julian, who had accompanied her, as he had accompanied her through every difficult step of the past 3 weeks. "I used to think this house was the whole of the world, both when I was a happy child running through these halls, and later, when I was a prisoner, counting the walls of a single room. Now it is simply a house, large certainly, and full of memory, but simply a house, not the boundary of everything I am permitted to be. What will you do with it?" "I have thought about that a great deal these past weeks." Cordelia walked slowly through the front hall, trailing her fingers along a banister she had not touched freely in 5 years. "I do not think I could live here comfortably. Not for a long while yet. Not with so many rooms still holding the shape of what happened to me within these walls. But I do not wish to sell it either, or abandon it to sit empty the way the East Wing sat empty for so long, gathering dust and secrets. I think, perhaps, I will restore it properly, open it to the county again as my father once kept it, and find some way to make it a place of welcome rather than a place of hiding. A house should hold a family's joy, not bury its grief behind locked doors." "That sounds like exactly the sort of decision your father would have been proud of." Cordelia smiled, the first easy, unguarded smile Julian had seen from her since that first candlelit night behind a broken door. "He would have liked you, I think. He was fond of clever, stubborn people who refused to leave a puzzle unsolved, once they had noticed it needed solving." "I am fond of at least one clever, stubborn person myself," Julian said, and something in the careful lightness of his tone did not quite match the seriousness building behind his eyes. "Cordelia, I did not come to Renwick Hall looking for anything beyond the settlement of an old debt. I have found, instead, something I never expected to find at all, and I do not intend to simply walk away from it now that the danger has passed and the courts have done their work." She turned to face him fully, her heart beating faster than the quiet hallway around them would have suggested was warranted. "What are you asking, Julian?" "I am asking you to consider a future beyond simply surviving what was done to you. I am asking whether a woman who spent 5 years fighting to reclaim her own name might be willing to share it, eventually, when she is ready and not one moment before, with a man who intends to spend the rest of his life making certain she never again has cause to feel small, or hidden, or afraid inside her own home." Julian's voice remained steady, But his hands, Cordelia noticed, were not entirely still. I am not asking for an answer today. You have earned the right to take whatever time you need, for this decision, and for every decision that follows it, for the rest of your life. I am simply telling you plainly that I intend to remain nearby, for as long as it takes, hoping you might eventually choose me the way you chose to trust me that first night, cautiously, and then completely. Cordelia studied him for a long moment, standing in the front hall of a house that had once been her whole world, and then her whole prison, and was now, finally, simply her own, and felt something settle inside her chest that was steadier and surer than anything she had allowed herself to feel in 5 long years. I do not need time, she said. I spent 5 years learning exactly how precious time truly is, and exactly how easily it can be taken from a person who waits too long to claim what she wants. She reached for his hand, holding it firmly, deliberately, the way she had never quite allowed herself to before. Ask me again properly, Julian Ashbourne, and I promise you my answer will not require any waiting at all. He laughed then, surprised and delighted, and asked her properly, right there in the front hall of Renwick Hall with autumn light spilling warm across the old stone floor, and Cordelia Vane, once declared dead by a family that had wanted her fortune more than her life, said yes without a single moment's hesitation. Their wedding took place the following spring, in the restored gardens of Renwick Hall itself, beneath an old oak tree Cordelia remembered climbing as a small girl, before grief and greed had locked her away from sunlight for 5 long years. Mrs. Aldridge stood among the guests with tears openly on her cheeks, having finally, fully, earned the right to see the girl she had once dressed for a funeral dressed instead for a wedding of her own choosing. Magistrate Whitby attended as well, raising a quiet toast to justice done properly and late rather than not at all. Even Edmund appeared briefly, standing at the back of the gathering, offering Cordelia a stiff, awkward bow of genuine congratulation, before departing again into whatever quieter, humbler life remained available to him. The restoration of the house itself had taken most of the winter, carpenters and glaziers working through the cold months to strip away every board that had ever sealed the east wing from daylight, to repair floors gone soft with years of neglect, to fill the old corridor with furniture and warmth rather than dust and silence. Cordelia had insisted on overseeing much of the work herself, walking the wing daily alongside the workmen, and there was something quietly triumphant in watching the small room that had once held her prisoner transformed, board by board and window by window, into simply another bright, ordinary bedroom in a house full of them, indistinguishable at last from any other room where a family might sleep peacefully through an untroubled night. On the morning of the wedding itself, Mrs. Aldridge helped Cordelia dress in a gown of pale gold silk, her hands as gentle and careful as they had been on the day she dressed a grieving 6-year-old for her mother's funeral, though her expression this time held nothing but joy. I never thought I would live to see this day, Mrs. Aldridge said, fastening the last small button at Cordelia's back, her voice thick with emotion she no longer had any reason to hide. I used to lie awake some nights, in those 5 years, wondering whether I had done wrong by staying silent as long as I did, whether I might have found the courage sooner to help you. I hope you know I am sorry for every year that courage took too long to arrive. You found it when it mattered most, Cordelia said, turning to take the older woman's hands in her own. I do not measure your loyalty by the years you stayed silent, Mrs. Aldridge. I measure it by the night you chose, finally, to act, knowing exactly what it might cost you. That is the only measure that matters to me now, and it always will be. Renwick Hall, restored fully to warmth and welcome under its rightful air, stood open to daylight in every room, its boarded windows long since stripped and repaired, its east wing rebuilt entirely, no locked oak door remaining anywhere within its walls. Cordelia Ashbourne, Duchess of Ashbourne, walked its halls freely each morning, sunlight falling across floors that had once known only shadow, and never once, for the rest of her long and finally happy life, forgot exactly how precious the simple, ordinary gift of an open door truly was. 2 years after the wedding beneath the old oak tree, a carriage bearing the Ashbourne crest rolled up the long drive of Renwick Hall on a bright summer afternoon, carrying home a duchess who had spent the past month visiting her husband's northern estate and was more than ready to see her own gardens again. Cordelia stepped down before the carriage had fully stopped, too eager to wait for the footman's steady hand, and found the front doors of Renwick Hall already thrown open wide to greet her, sunlight spilling across the front hall exactly as it had every single day since the restoration was completed. Mrs. Aldridge stood waiting at the top of the steps, a small bundle held carefully in her arms, and Cordelia's heart lifted at the sight before she had even crossed half the distance between them. There you are, Mrs. Aldrich said warmly, passing the sleeping infant into Cordelia's waiting arms with the practiced gentleness of a woman who had cared for children her whole life. She has been asking for her mother all morning, in the only language a 6-month-old knows how to ask in, which is a great deal of fussing and very little patience. Cordelia looked down at her daughter's small, sleeping face, dark-haired like her own, and felt the same fierce, grateful tenderness that had settled over her the moment the child was born, a feeling she still, even now, sometimes had to remind herself she was fully entitled to feel. A little over a year into her marriage, she had given birth to a daughter she and Julian named Eleanor, after Cordelia's own mother, whose funeral Mrs. Aldrich had dressed her for so many years before, in a life that felt now like it belonged to an entirely different woman. Has she truly been fussing all morning, or are you simply glad of an excuse to hold her a little longer before I claimed her back? Cordelia asked, smiling. Mrs. Aldrich did not bother denying it, and merely smiled in return, following Cordelia into the house. Renwick Hall in summer had become, over these past 2 years, exactly the sort of house Cordelia had once promised herself she would build from the ashes of her own imprisonment. The east wing, fully restored, now served as a bright nursery, and a set of comfortable guest rooms, filled most weekends with visiting friends, and the occasional curious neighbor eager to see how thoroughly the old scandal had been transformed into something warm and welcoming. The gardens Cordelia had once glimpsed only through a narrow gap in a boarded shutter now bloomed fully open beneath her own careful attention, and she spent long summer mornings there with Eleanor, teaching her small daughter the names of flowers the way her own father had once taught her, patiently, delightedly, treating every small discovery as a treasure worth celebrating. Julian found them there that evening, mother and daughter seated together beneath the same old oak tree where their wedding vows had been spoken, Eleanor now awake and reaching with fascinated concentration for a fallen leaf just beyond her small grasp. "I did not expect you home until tomorrow," Cordelia said, looking up as he crossed the lawn toward them. "I finished my business early, and found I had very little patience left for one more night away from either of you." Julian settled onto the grass beside them, and Eleanor immediately abandoned her interest in the leaf in favor of her father's watch chain, which she attempted to seize with the fierce, single-minded determination of a very small person discovering the world one bright, shiny object at a time. "How was the north?" "Beautiful, and cold even in summer, and I missed this garden the entire time I was there." Cordelia leaned against his shoulder, watching Eleanor's small fingers close triumphantly around the watch chain at last. "I had a letter from Edmund while I was away. Did I mention it? He has taken a position as a clerk in a shipping office in Bristol, of all places. He wrote to ask, rather nervously, whether I would object to him mentioning our family connection to his employer, since it seems having a duchess for a cousin has become, in his current circumstances, a point of some social usefulness rather than embarrassment." "And what did you tell him?" "That he was welcome to mention it, provided he continued conducting himself honestly in whatever position he held. I do not believe in punishing a man forever, for choices he ultimately found the courage to correct, even if that courage arrived rather later than I might have wished." Cordelia watched a pair of sparrows dart low across the lawn, remembering, briefly and without the sharp pain it once carried, the sound of birdsong through a cracked shutter, heard from a room she had once believed she would never truly leave. "Besides, I find I have very little appetite left for old grievances these days. There is too much good in this present life to spend it dwelling on the worst years of the last one." Julian pressed a kiss to the top of her head, and the three of them sat together beneath the old oak tree as the summer evening settled gently around them, the great house behind them glowing warm with lamplight in every window, not a single board or shutter darkening any room within it. Later that year, Renwick Hall hosted its first proper autumn gathering since the Restoration, a harvest celebration Cordelia had insisted upon reviving from her own childhood memories, when her father had once opened the estate each autumn to tenants and neighbors alike, for an evening of music and simple, generous hospitality. Mrs. Aldrich oversaw the kitchens with the same brisk efficiency she had once brought to counting linens in a house built on secrets, though now her efficiency served celebration rather than concealment. Magistrate Whitby attended as an honored guest, raising another quiet toast, as he had at the wedding, to a story that had ended, against considerable odds, exactly as justice demanded it should. Cordelia stood in the front hall that evening, watching lamplight and laughter fill rooms that had once known only silence and locked doors, Eleanor asleep upstairs in a nursery that had once been the loneliest room in the entire county, and felt, for perhaps the first time since her father's death so many years before, that the house around her had finally, fully become what he had always intended it to be, not a place of hiding, and not a place of grief, but simply and completely a home, filled with exactly the kind of ordinary, open-hearted joy that no locked door had ever managed to erase from her memory, no matter how many years it had tried. A young woman Cordelia did not immediately recognize approached her partway through the evening, hesitant and clearly nervous, dressed simply but neatly among the more finely dressed guests filling the hall. It took Cordelia a moment to place her, and when she did, the recognition arrived with a small jolt of surprise. "You are the maid who used to carry the soup," Cordelia said, "years ago, up the servants' stair, before any of this happened." The young woman, whose name Cordelia now remembered was Susan, flushed with a mixture of pleasure and embarrassment at being recognized after so long. "I did not think you would remember me, Your Grace. I left this household not long after everything came out, took a position in the village instead. I did not have the courage to stay on here, not after everything, though I have always been glad, truly glad, that things turned out as they did for you." "I remember you very well," Cordelia said, and meant it. "You were kind to me when kindness cost you something to give. I have never forgotten that, even in all the busyness of these past 2 years. Please, stay for the evening. There is a place for you here, whenever you wish it, whether for one harvest celebration or for something more permanent, if ever you find yourself wanting steadier work again." Susan's eyes filled with unexpected tears, and she thanked Cordelia quietly before slipping back into the crowd, and Cordelia found herself thinking, not for the first time, of all the small, quiet kindnesses that had carried her through those 5 locked years: a maid's soup, a housekeeper's eventual courage, a duke's stubborn refusal to accept a lie repeated twice at a dinner table. None of those kindnesses had been large on their own. Together, they had been enough to save her life. The musicians struck up a livelier tune as the evening deepened, and tenants and neighbors alike took to the floor of the great hall, the same hall where Cordelia had once been carried out as a supposedly dying child, and had returned, years later, as its rightful mistress. She watched the dancing for a while with quiet pleasure, content simply to observe rather than join in, until Julian appeared at her side once more, offering his hand with a small, familiar smile. "One dance," he said, "before Eleanor wakes and demands the whole of your attention again, as she inevitably will before this evening is through." Cordelia laughed and took his hand, and they moved together into the crowd of dancing tenants and neighbors, the great house around them filled with music and lamplight, and the easy, ordinary laughter of people who had no reason at all to lower their voices or watch the doorways with careful, practiced fear. It was, Cordelia thought, exactly the kind of evening her father had always intended this house to hold, and exactly the kind of evening she intended to keep giving it, year after year, for as long as Renwick Hall remained hers to fill with joy rather than silence. Near midnight, as the last of the guests began gathering their coats and calling for their carriages, Cordelia climbed the main staircase to check on Eleanor one final time before retiring herself. She found her daughter sleeping peacefully in the nursery that had once been the loneliest room in the county, moonlight falling soft and unguarded through a window that had not known a single board across it in over 2 years, and stood for a long moment simply watching her daughter breathe, safe and warm and utterly unaware of the long, difficult road that had made this ordinary, peaceful moment possible at all. She found Julian near the garden doors, watching the celebration with the same quiet contentment she felt herself, and slipped her hand into his without a single word needing to pass between them. Outside, beyond the open doors, the last golden light of the harvest evening spread warm and unguarded, across gardens that had once been visible to her only through a narrow gap in a boarded window, and Cordelia Ashbourne, Duchess of Ashbourne, watched it fall freely across her own home, her own family, and her own hard-won, thoroughly unlocked life.